King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were the most powerful couple in the world. But when they sat down for royal feasts, they were unknowingly poisoning themselves. From Frankenstein meats sewn together to bread that caused violent hallucinations, today we're uncovering the disgusting reality of what actually destroyed the Tudors from the inside out. You're about to see why Henry's extreme overeating wasn't his biggest health problem. It was the invisible guests living in every single bite. If a modern health inspector walked into the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace in 1533, they wouldn't just shut them down. They'd treat them as a crime scene. That's because one specific human ingredient was regularly added to the king's sauce, creating a secret so vile it would turn even the strongest stomach. The Tudor court was home to nearly 1,000 people because it was the center of government and power. As a result, the kitchen had to operate like a large food factory rather than a small, elegant dining room. But the stakes were actually far higher than just putting delicious food on the table. Henry VIII ruled over an uncertain dynasty, obsessed with producing a male heir to secure his legacy. With the constant fear of poisoning, the cooks held dangerous power. A single mistake didn't just mean a bad meal. It meant political instability or a death sentence for treason. And as if that pressure weren't enough, the reality inside the kitchens was even more brutal. Hundreds of workers performed different tasks all at once. Butchers literally worked ankle-deep in blood. Meat was constantly being slaughtered and immediately prepared on site because without modern refrigeration, the cooks were in a constant battle against rot. The Tudors genuinely valued cleanliness and ritual hand-washing, but their understanding of hygiene was a fatal delusion. In their minds, water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Because people would not discover bacteria for another 3 centuries, Tudors believed that rubbing hands with a clean, dry cloth was often the better option. Maintaining hygiene was especially important because the heat inside the royal kitchens caused a lot of problems. Dozens of fireplaces burned constantly to roast meat on large spits. The men assigned to turn those spits worked for hours, sometimes completely naked to survive the unbearable heat. The cooks also sweated heavily. That meant their sweat, grime, and hair almost certainly ended up in Henry and Anne's food. But the unholy dishes prepared in these kitchens were far more disturbing than the sweat itself. Chefs were literally creating monsters that shouldn't exist, born only for a single night of kingly entertainment. Henry wanted to impress his court with visual creativity rather than just flavor. Exotic dishes and large feasts were a way to showcase the king's power. Meals were meant to provoke awe or laughter. While peasants relied on vegetables for survival, royalty and nobility looked at them with fear. Tudor doctors believed a simple carrot could trigger a deadly fever. There was also a strong belief that the upper class was too refined for the vegetables eaten by the poor. Therefore, for Henry and Anne, meat was the ultimate status symbol. A royal feast would feature dozens of controversial meat dishes that no one on earth today would dare to put in their mouth. You might think roasted peacocks, swans, or river eels sound exotic, but at Henry's table, those were just the decorations. While he loved unusual animals, he was truly obsessed with the Frankenstein dishes, meat that didn't actually exist in nature. To satisfy Henry's hunger for the impossible, head cooks acted more like surgeons than chefs, turning the dinner table into a stage for a gruesome theater of the absurd. Henry demanded monsters on his table. Visually, these dishes were meant to shock. Guests were likely impressed by the technical skill and boldness of the presentation, even if the dish was hard to eat gracefully. Cooks would take a whole pig's head, stuff it with dried fruit, and stitch it onto the back end of a roasted chicken. Some feathers remained on parts of the meat to make the presentation even more striking. But these bizarre creatures were actually the cleanest thing on the menu. Because while the meat was disturbing, it was the bread that held a terrifying secret. One that could literally make the entire court see demons. In Tudor England, eating a single slice of bread could literally cost you your life or your limbs. Entire villages across Europe were being struck by a terrifying phenomenon they called St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms were like something straight out of your worst nightmares. Victims felt like their skin was constantly burning, even though there was no visible injury. Blood would stop reaching their fingers and toes. The tissue would die, turn pitch black, and eventually limbs would simply fall off. But the physical rot wasn't the worst part. This sickness also attacked the mind, causing victims to see terrifying visions. Because 16th century doctors didn't understand hallucinations, they only had three explanations: witchcraft, demonic possession, or divine punishment. Sick people began to convulse and scream about seeing twisted faces, shadows, and demons grabbing at them from the dark. While this plague mostly affected the poor, being rich was no absolute shield. It only reduced your risk. The sickness was sporadic, tied closely to the weather. The real culprit was a fungus, a tiny, mold-like organism that thrives on rye plants, forming a hard, dark spur that looks almost identical to a normal grain. These toxic compounds survived the baking process, meaning families ate these poisonous breads regularly. While there is no evidence that King Henry or Anne were ever affected, the threat was always lurking. However, there was a far more realistic danger waiting for them in their palaces, one that could actually poison the Queen and the King with ease. The Tudor court was a golden death trap. While Anne famously feared the daggers of Catherine of Aragon's supporters, the most lethal threats were the ones she could not see. Royals lived in a state of constant paranoia, haunted by rumors of Lucrezia and Cesare Borgia in Italy, who eliminated rivals with a drop of tasteless poison in wine. To stay alive, Henry and Anne turned their meals into a security operation. Special workers had to taste a small portion of every single dish before the monarchs took a bite. It sounded smart. In reality, it was mostly useless. Historical evidence shows that intentional poisoning in England was actually rare. But Anne and Henry were poisoning themselves a little bit every day. They just did not realize the killer was their own luxurious tableware. Everything was going wrong in the royal kitchen. The royals loved meat pies, a bizarre, sugary jumble of songbirds, lampreys, and organ meats. But the ingredients were the least of their problems. As mentioned earlier, Tudor hygiene was not just bad, it was a biological disaster. Tudor knives were made of carbon steel or iron, which rusted the moment they touched water. To prevent it, greasy and bloody knives were scrubbed with wood ash to scrape them clean. Then they were wiped dry with linen rags that were almost never washed. These rags were essentially mobile colonies of bacteria. Even worse, many of these royal pies looked perfectly golden on the outside but were stone-cold raw in the middle. These undercooked centers were breeding grounds for tapeworms, roundworms, and deadly infections. Add flies and rats, and every royal feast became a game where the prizes were diseases causing vomiting, diarrhea, or even death. If Henry had understood the biological war his cooks were accidentally waging, they would have been sent to the block immediately. Yet there was one occasion when a cook's actions terrified the king so deeply that he decided a simple beheading was not enough. He invented a new, terrifying method of execution, a punishment so brutal it was used only on him. In February 1531, Richard Roos, a cook in the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, made an awful mistake. He claimed it was meant to be a prank, but it went terribly wrong. Multiple people became violently ill after eating porridge he had prepared. Fisher survived, but 2 others were not so lucky. The accused cook claimed he had added poison to the food as a joke, without intending to commit murder, but that explanation was not believed. When news reached Henry, he decided to invent a punishment so brutal that it would haunt the dreams of every cook in England. The king did not just see a murderer. He saw a threat to his own survival and safety. Ordinary murder was punished with the rope, but poisoning was the coward's weapon, a silent killer hidden in life's most basic necessity, food. To Henry, this was not just a crime. Instead of using normal treason or murder law, Parliament passed a special act declaring poisoning to be high treason. Henry needed a creative response extreme enough to stop any future assassin in their tracks. What happened to Richard Roos was one of the most brutal executions in Tudor England. The execution took place at Smithfield in London, a site used for public punishments. Crowds gathered, as executions were public spectacles meant to deter crime. Roos would have been brought out under guard. Contemporary sources suggest he was tied so he could not escape. A large metal cauldron was set up over a strong fire. It was filled with water and brought to a rolling boil. This would have taken time as large quantities of water heat slowly. Accounts describe the execution as lasting long enough for the horror to register with the crowd. Roos was lowered into the cauldron. The cause of death would have been extreme thermal injury, leading to shock and organ failure. The method symbolically matched the crime. A cook who killed with food was punished by being cooked. But Queen Anne herself might have fallen victim to strange organisms hidden in her meal. Somehow she caught a sickness so strange that doctors, to this day, cannot explain its symptoms. Check the previous video to discover the story.